During the first 100 years of the rediscovery of early Netherlandish painting, Berlin was one of the major places of research and connoisseurship. Based on the romantic concept of northern art, the philosopher Hegel and scholars like Wagen and Roto shaped their philosophical, technical, and cultural view on the works of Jan van Eyck and his followers. My presentation examines this early view on northern art of the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, with special reference to the differences as well as the similarities between the ideas of scholars like the connoisseur Wagen and the philosophical researcher Roto. In contrast to their position, the late 19th century is characterized by a remarkable shift of interests. While the young researcher Ludwig Scheibler redefined and completed the matrix of 15th century painting, his superior Wilhelm Bode elaborated a new perspective on Mannerist painters like Jan Gossard and Jan van Scorre. In the course of the 19th century, the rediscovery of Netherlandish painting was characterized by a diversity of methods and hybrid junctions between controversial positions, and none of them can claim to be the one and only founding moment. Before we go ahead with the situation in Berlin, we should recap on the first decades of 19th century Germany. During the Napoleonic era, many churches and cloisters were forced to close because of secularization. A lot of altar pieces were sold at low prices, sometimes converted into decoration for pubs and guest houses, sometimes destroyed completely. However, in this short period of 5 years, a new art market emerged and new collectors and new interests in the unknown art of the northern schools. The rapidly growing collections of Franz Ferdinand Wallraff, the brothers Sulpice and Melchior Boisseré, and others contained pieces of the German and Netherlandish schools, but most of the time collectors were unable to attribute their true masters. As we know, the medieval city of Cologne was a central hub of economic trade and artistic transaction, so it is no wonder that there was a mixture of artistic styles. For example, the altar pieces by Rogier van der Weyden or Stefan Lochner. One of the main tasks of the collectors was to advance an historical system of periods and stylistic influences between the regions of the Netherlands and Germany, as well as to identify the main masters by comparing the artworks with written records like the book by Karel van Mander. It is clear from the letters and diaries of Sulpice Boisseré the collecting practice evolved by matching the visual results and the literal sources. By arranging his collection, Boisseré developed an efficient system which could be attributed to particular schools and singular masters. He compared the pictures and defined stylistic differences, most of the time mistakenly twinning the names of famous masters with high-quality pictures. It is not surprising then that Sulpice attributed the Columba altarpiece by Rogier van der Weyden as a work by Jan van Eyck, and the seemingly older-looking Cologne works by Rogier's contemporary Stefan Lochner as works by a medieval master named Meister Wilhelm. There is no doubt that these first steps contained a lot of errors, but they also shaped a new method and helped to gather new evidence in art history. This new framework of periods, styles, and influences was part of Romantic thought, initiated by Boisseré's mentor Friedrich Schlegel, one of the protagonists of the German Romantic movement. Schlegel's and Boisseré's art practice came from a highly charged emotional connection with Christianity. A patriotic and religious behavior of the time was one of the reasons why the Boisseré collection became so popular when it was shown in Heidelberg and Stuttgart during the years from 1808 to 1827. And as you know, it was purchased by the Bavarian king, Ludwig I. From a romantic viewpoint, the collection was credible due to its emotional and religious content. From the classical view, for instance, Goethe, the Netherlandish artwork stood for a fascinating and remarkable culture which realized the classical ideal of high plasticity and vividness. As a result of this, the new scholars of art history made a remarkable shift in their research interests. The aesthetic primacy of Italian art was broken in favor of the northern schools because of their technical knowledge and their detailed realism. Considering this initial situation, the view of early Netherlandish painting provided optimal conditions for a new perception on art that integrated the different elements of classical, romantic, and realistic art theory. A compromise that seems typical of the Biedermeier culture, yet helped create a solution to the conflict between classical, antique, and romantic modern painting aesthetics. Based on this intellectual property, Berlin became the main center of research in Germany. The reason for this was most certainly the growing collection of the Prussian state and the linked activities of the founding of a museum opened in 1830. The most important acquisition, or one of the most important acquisitions, was the whole collection of the British trader Edward Solly in 1821, which contained 6 panels of the Ghent altarpiece by Hubert and Jan van Eyck. During the long negotiation of sale, the collection was shown in Solly's house in Wilhelmstraße 67 near the Brandenburger Tor. Most of his numerous paintings were stacked warehouse-like in various rooms. The 6 wings of the Ghent altarpiece, however, were well displayed and accessible to view. Johanna Schopenhauer, the mother of the famous philosopher, described catching a glimpse of the singing angels through a neighboring room. A sharp, bright ray of sun illuminated the painting, and the angels seemed to step out of the frame and stand free and alive in the room. So deceiving is the truth of this painting, finished down to every look of hair. Without any doubt, this panel of the singing angels opened the eyes of the Berlin Cultural Society, connecting the image with the popular practice of Hausmusik, part of the synesthetic concept of romantic thought. After the panels were bought by the Prussian state, they became a central focal point in the new museum's collection that was opened in 1830 at the Lustgarten. The 6 Ghent panels were exhibited on the 2nd floor in the first chamber on the northwest side of the building. They marked the beginning of the 2nd section, which extended from the Van Eycks to Holbein the Younger, while the first section consisted of Italians, beginning with the painting of the Quattrocento. Following a suggestion by art connoisseur Carl Friedrich von Rumor, the Van Eycken panels formed the Archimedean point of the entire upper floor of the museum. The hall was adjacent to the illumination room with the works by Antonello da Messina, who, according to Vasari, introduced to Italy the oil technique invented by Jan van Eyck. From these first adjacent rooms, the Italian and northern sections continued on in opposite directions and in approximate chronological order. Rumor's suggestion was intended to allow the German and Italian collections to encounter one another at the point where they touched each other in a manner decisive to the development of art. This approach shows how significantly the northern schools reached an equal rank with Italian art in such a very short time of 20 years and also in curatorial practice. Friedrich Gustav Wagen was the first director of the Königliche Museum, whose early book über Hubert und Johann von Eyck was an important contribution to research concerning the brothers van Eyck. published in 1820, Wagen argued for a new historical and critic method. He tried to reconstruct the development of the works, but most of the time his research wasn't based on real evidence of the paintings, as he accepted the old attributions like Rugias Columba altarpiece as a late work by Jan van Eyck. Indeed, in his book, the young Wagen makes statements rather than developing a real practice of connoisseurship. His main task is to gather information and compare the literal sources, but most of these claims are not obtained through visual experience. In my opinion, the results are more than disappointing. Coming to Berlin 2 years later, Wagen became the first art historian who examined the Ghent panels after they had been cleaned. He published the inscription on the frame, attempted to attribute the personal hand of Hubert or Jan, and reconstructed the polyptych arrangement of the 12 panels. In contrast to Wagen, the Berlin art historian Heinrich Gustav Hotto has the reputation of being a theoretician and not a real connoisseur until quite recently. Hotto edited the famous aesthetic lectures by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and there is no question that large parts of the book are of Hotto's own intellectual property. Hotto worked as assistant of Wagen, but as we know, the relationship between both art historians was obviously tense. Years later, Hotto became director of the Prince department, but this seems only a pretense to get rid of him and keep him away from the responsible tasks of the museum. As well as Wagen, Hotto gave public lectures at the Berlin University. His lecture concerning Netherlandish and German painting was published in 1842. In my opinion, it is a remarkable contribution on a historical view on Northern art of the late Middle Ages. Like his teacher Hegel, Hotto uses a dialectic model of contrast between ideal and real parts of art, and he focuses on the development of urban patricians and their advancement in trading with luxurious goods. In dialectic manner, he traces the realism of Netherlandish art to an early form of capitalism, but in the same time he considers the religious faith of the patrons. In Hotto's opinion, this tension constituted the origin of Netherlandish realism that made religious life a part of the fabric of existence, not of an unearthly transcendence. He hated the heightened observation of the material surface of precious woven cloth or jewelry marks the emergence of a Protestantism avant la lettre. Hotto's view on Netherlandish culture is a very bold one, explaining the origin of realism through social and mental conditions. Nevertheless, it is a strong attempt to build a connection between the classical and romantic view on art that presents a concept of reconciliation of two antagonistic aesthetic principles viewed from a very specific social and historical lens. Therefore, it is surprising that theorist Hotto contributed some milestones in the development of connoisseurship as well. In his lecture, he argued that the Danzig altarpiece could be a work by Hans Memling and not a work by Jan van Eyck. Another result concerned attributions to Hieronymus Bosch and another result concerned attributions to Hieronymus Bosch and a large another result concerned attributions to Hieronymus Bosch and another result concerned attributions to Hieronymus Bosch and in 1841 the Berlin Museum bought another triptych that also seemed to be a work of Bosch, depicting the temptation of St. Anthony. Comparing the strong contoured style and the opaque colors of the Last Judgment with the fluent and transparent brush marks of this newly commissioned painting, Hoto noted clearly the formal differences between both triptychs and argued that both works were made by different masters. As a result, he identified the Last Judgment as a copy by Lucas Cranach. Hoto could not have been familiar with the original artwork by Bosch in Vienna. However, the Cranach-like figures allowed him to identify that the three panels as copy made by Cranach. Today, we know that the Berlin triptych of the Temptation of St. Anthony is a copy of Bosch's Lisbon altarpiece. But Hoto was going in the right direction, because this triptych shows a technical style closer to Bosch and stresses the differences of the Berlin judgment to the strong personal hand of Cranach. Hence, these two Berlin copies after Bosch help to shape a clear concept of an original master. In comparison with the well-known, more conservative connoisseurs like Wagen and Johann David Passavant, the example by Hoto illustrates the importance of a speculative approach in garnering diverse knowledge regarding Netherlandish art history in 19th century. The rediscovery of early Netherlandish painting is a complex proceeding of theoretic and aesthetic presuppositions as well as the traditional components of visual memory and subjective evaluation. The process of connoisseurship stagnated for 1 or 2 decades after the death of Wagen, Passavant, and Hoto. In the 1880s, Bode's assistant Ludwig Scheibler brought new impetus to investigation on early Netherlandish painting. For example, he attributed an anonymous panel of the raising of Lazarus to Albert van Auwaerter from a picture that was mentioned by Karel van Mander. Scheibler was also investigating the oeuvre of Hugo van der Goes and guided the young Max Friedländer toward the occupation of connoisseurship. Today, Scheibler is relatively unknown, but he was an important part of a substantial cooperation of art historians of the Berlin Museum. The established theory of stable national and regional styles with more or less homogeneous characteristics seemed to be a perfect model which went unquestioned till the 1880s. However, this concept became more problematic when research attention turned towards Netherlandish masters, which had been worked in Italy in the early 16th century and had adapted stylistic manners of masters of Italian Renaissance. With the investigation of the seemingly hybrid works by Jan Gossard or Maarten van Heemskerk, Barend van Orley, the Netherlandish mannerism came into stark focus of the researchers. The relationship between the Italian and the northern schools of painting had to be redefined. One of the significant debates was the investigation of the works by Jan van Scorel. Van Mander described the painter as one of the famous artists in the 16th century and recorded that Scorel was in Italy in the 1520s. Van Mander reiterates furthermore that the artist made a visit to the Dürer workshop in Nuremberg and he painted a big altarpiece in Oberwellach, Austria. But unfortunately, none of his original works seem to exist anymore as a result of the iconoclasm riots in the Low Countries in 1566. It is no wonder that this prominent master without works aroused interest of the boiseries and other connoisseurs. For a period of 80 years, the research of this famous painter was like hunting a phantom, triggering fierce controversies about the real artistic identity. One of the prominent altarpieces in the Brasserie collection was the Cologne triptych of the Death of the Virgin, depicting the realistic qualities, for example, the glossy metal and the detailed interior on the one hand, and the dynamic narrative structure of the composition on the other hand, Sulpice Boissari assumed a Netherlandish master who had been in Italy, and it seemed more than likely that the unknown author of this high-quality triptych was none other than Jan van Scorrel. In the following years, the triptych became famous and most admired by visitors of the collection like Goethe, Humboldt, and others. Boissari's attribution came into crisis when discovering an altarpiece in the Abbey of Steinfeld in the Eifel. The panel was signed with Schorle and depicted a seemingly hybrid form of Netherlandish and Italian influences, but its individual characteristics revealed something completely different to that of the death of the Virgin. For this reason, Boissari was not willing to accept this new attribution, as he disliked the Steinfeld panel because of the, in his opinion, grotesque and rough mannerism that was not compatible to the gentle depiction of the death of Virgin. In the next years, most connoisseurs argued the reverse by conceding the possibility that the death of Virgin could be a work by a German master. And as we know, since 1898, it is clearly a work by Jos van Cleve. However, there seemed to be a turn again in favor of the old attribution by Boissari, as Austrian art historians examined the altarpiece in Oberwellach with a clear attribution to Scorrel in 1880. The complete style seemed to be very similar to the death of Virgin. In 1882, Wilhelm Bode and his assistant Ludwig Scheibler published a catalogue raisonné of the works by Scorrel. It is amazing that they argued against the death of Virgin and for the Steinfeld panel. The accompanying article by the Bonn art historian Karl Justi stressed a radical stylistic conversion due to Scorrel's stay in Italy that shows the differences between the Oberwellach altarpiece and the Steinfeld panel. In his argumentation, Justi was more correct than the advocates for the death of Virgin. However, his view was more or less a philosophical one, as he stressed the activity and high adaptivity of the artistic subject, and not the concept of an homogeneous style with little possibility of changing its characteristics. The irony of 19th century connoisseurship lies in the fact that key situations were dependent on philosophical concepts as well as on artworks which were not made in the original hand of the assumed artist. Hotto reviewed the Berlin copy of the Lisbon altarpiece as an original by Bosch. Justi, Bode and Scheibler assumed that the Steinfeld panel was an original by Jan van Scorrel without knowing that this work was a copy also and showed a wrong signature. In both cases, they were mistaken, but they constituted a new and important view on the investigated artists and helped shape a distinctive and coherent concept of individual artistic style and technique. In early 18th century, the first connoisseurs developed a method of deciphering the differences between originals and copies. In 19th century, we have a paradoxical situation where copies included sometimes more true accounts for clarifying styles than most of the originals. In other words, the errors of Boissari, Hotto, Wagen, Justi or Bode helped clarify the rich complexity of Netherlandish art history and were essential in initiating a new development of research. Secondly, I would like to propose that the rediscovery of early Netherlandish painting was the task of not only the task of the real connoisseurs, it was the task of the theoretic art historians too. Yet it is to stress that both groups invented this new vision of art history. And to conclude, connoisseurship was not an act of isolated individuals who followed their own subjective view. In fact, connoisseurship is a process of series of events involving several groups of art historians engaged in debate and vivid discussion. Thank you for your attention.